All right, let's talk about crawling. Ultimately, in the audit, you're going to want to check to see whether or not you've inadvertently blocked crawling. Let's first talk about the crawl budget. Because ultimately, if you want a URL crawled, as well as eventually stuck in the index and then ranked well, you have to make sure that the URL is discoverable, and the Google needs to make sure that the URL is valuable, so it's given it a high priority in the crawl list. And that's driven by how frequently a page is updated, how many human beings have actually visited the page, and the server effort to crawl your URL. That one's important because if you have a page that loads too slowly, Google might not prioritize it as much. Okay. Ultimately, you want the crawl budget to be as big as it possibly can be, and you don't want Google to waste time on URLs you don't care about. This one's really important. I spent a lot of time in audits looking at inadvertent URLs that have been created by a CMS system that are basically thin content. It's nothing you strategically created, but you're not blocking crawling of them. So Google is spending all this time crawling infinite pages that are kind of useless. That's just wasting their time. You want to make sure you're not doing that. You're strategically directing them to the pages you want crawled and indexed. And then one final note, the crawl budget is not set per domain, but it's set per IP because you might have more than one IP address for one domain. So just keep that in mind as you're auditing. So when Google sets a crawl budget, ultimately they don't want to be embarrassed by somebody looking for something that's not up to date in its index. So it'll keep that in mind, which means sites that I've audited that are bigger, they're more authoritative, Google's been a bit more lax about their crawl budget because they want to make sure they've got that stuff in the index. I would assume, however, that if you're a very small business, Google might not give you as much laxity around that. Google's also going to look at the server expenditure that it uses in order to crawl your URL because ultimately it's a business and it needs to balance the amount of effort it's going to take to actually crawl your URL and make sure it's fresh and up to date based in comparison to how much people are going to need it in search. So if you have a huge site, you got to be really careful about dynamic pages and anything else that might waste Google's crawl budget because you want to make sure you've got the largest crawl budget as possible. And you want to make sure that when they do define a crawl budget for your site, they're using that to crawl the URLs that you really care about. So if also the other thing is that you might get a lower crawl budget if Google is crawling your site and finds a bunch of garbage. So stuff that is thin or low value, this often gets created by session identifiers, faceted navigation, inadvertent duplicate content, or maybe advertent, but most of the time when I see it, it's inadvertent. Error pages so like an internal search page that returns a 200, but it says no results found, that's usually shown as a 403, a soft error page. You shouldn't even let Google crawl your internal search results, though I've seen plenty of sites that have done that. If you have hacked pages, it's going to decrease your crawl budget as well, or anything that's spammy. Basically, anything that's going to waste server resources will result in Google giving you less of a crawl budget. All right, let's talk about robots.txt. Okay, so this is the file that you have at the highest level of your website that spiders will hit in order to figure out what part of your site you want them to crawl and what part of the site you don't want them to crawl. So you can use this to block entire sections of your site. So say you have a membership section, it's an internal section of your site, you just don't want search engines to see it, you can block that. It's a very powerful file. When I got my start in SEO, part of the reason I got my start is I'm at 1-800-volunteer.org. I'm the director of marketing and sales there. I'd been very focused on selling this thing because it was a website that was sort of rolled out broken with a bunch of issues, and I had a sales quota. Anyway, really focused on that, not so much focused on SEO. It was a home-built CMS system. The developers were having trouble scaling it, so as we got more users on board, the website was really slowing down and having trouble staying up. So I know they'd been tinkering with some stuff, but when the CFO came in one day, he says, hey, we're not on Google. Why are we not on Google? I'm like, oh my gosh, I have no idea. No idea. The last time I had done SEO, this is, mind you, 14 years ago, it was static HTML websites. So like 12 pages of static HTML. This is a home-built CMS system with all this dynamic stuff. And I said, well, send me to a search show and I'll figure it out. So I go to Search Engine Strategy Chicago. There's a big audit session. there's like 200 people in the room. They say, does anybody want their site audited? And so I raise my hand, and they say, well, okay, so in the robot.txt file, you've told Google to go away, and that's why you've fallen out of Google. Pretty simple, pretty embarrassing. So just be careful. There are times you want to use the robots.txt file, but you can block Google from crawling your site altogether. I've also seen that when sites get redesigned, when it's on the development server, they have adjusted the robots.txt file and they move that same file over to live. So suddenly your website's not found by Google. So powerful file, but be careful. Let's talk about how to audit and check it. So to find the file, you can use this text tester. You can also usually do the domain /robots.txt to find it. You can also find it inside Google Search Console. You just want to make sure that it's not blocking all spiders or disallowing huge sections of the site. You also, on the other end, once you've finished your audit, if you found lots of duplicate content and faceted navigation and other stuff like that, you should look to see whether or not that stuff should be blocked in the robots.txt file. You also want to make sure there's no errors. There's a tester tool inside Google Search Console that you can use to make sure that you set it up properly with the right syntax. You should also check to see whether or not you should potentially be using on-page no index headers instead of robots.txt. We'll talk about this a little bit later when we get into duplicate content, but there's two ways basically of blocking Google from hitting your content. One is on-page code. It's called no index in the header. No index, no follow, or you can block thing at a robots.txt level. Ideally, if Google has not found the page yet, then you should stick it in robots.txt. But if Google has found and indexed the page, they actually need to get back to the page in order to get your note that says, I don't want it in search, and take it out, which means you cannot put it in the robots.txt because they won't get to the page. So in that scenario, you actually want to put it on page for the page you want dropped out of search. That way, when Google recrawls and finds that page, they find your nice little note saying, please don't put this in the index, and they no index it. So that's basically the difference between the two. You're also going to want to make sure, again to the syntax part, you want to make sure that if you're using grouping and wildcards that you're doing that correctly, and you need to make sure the robots.txt is named correctly with all lowercase. And I've given you tons more resources on the lesson page about learning about robots.txt. So here's a great guide about setting up one. So if you have a client that does not even have one and you need to generate one and you want to make sure it's the right syntax, I use SEO Book's robots.txt generator. Makes it easy. This is what it looks like to test it inside Google Search Console Help. It also looks like this when you're inside an account that you have access to. And what's great is you can also, you can test individual pages. So I've gone ahead and disallowed a few things on my site. You can then check to make sure that my contact form or whatever is being blocked. Talking about blocking, the thing you don't want to do now actually is blocking JavaScript and CSS crawling. That's because Google does not want you to block any resources that they need to see in order to render your page correctly, because it could harm indexing of those pages. So to check whether or not you've blocked crawling, site-wide you would have to use crawl data, but page by page you could use Google Search Console's fetch and render or the blocked resources report. Oops. And then dips and crawl rate. That's the other piece you're going to want to check in the audit, because what I've seen again and again and again is that as the server load gets intense and things start slowing down on the website, so it's taking more time to load a page, you'll actually see that Google will crawl less. And that's because Google doesn't want to tank your website. So it doesn't want to crawl your website and be the reason that your website has totally fallen apart. And so you just want to be careful about moments where the server's having trouble keeping the website up. It will mean that Google will find less of your pages. And in general, if you see just a low crawl rate across the board, Google said that's because, or it's a sign that your site might be low quality in general. So you're going to want to check log files or your Google Search Console, the crawl and the crawl stats report. Let's talk about other crawl errors. 500 errors. Now these are when your website or your site or your server starts completely falling apart. like what would happen if there's a cat inside your machine. Ultimately, search engines need to actually get to your site in order to index it. And if they come to your site frequently and see that you have tons of trouble, it will result in them reducing your ranking or potentially removing your site from search altogether, because it's just not a good experience for users that are coming from Google. So it's basically the same as a penalty. So you want to make sure that you don't have those types of issues. So the way you would check this is the crawl tool reports inside your crawl tool. It'll show you all the pages that have 500 type errors. Google Search Console and Big Webmaster Tools also have a report for you. This is what it looks like inside Google. There's a desktop and a mobile version. And this is what it looks like inside of Bing. 400 errors. Oops, these are broken links, ultimately. So the impact of having broken links is that you're going to lose the page rank, which you got from outside links coming into that page, and it will be and that content will stop ranking, because obviously it's something that can't be found anymore. If you do a lot of this, I actually audited a site where they didn't have that many inbound links, but they had redesigned, and so suddenly they had lost a whole bunch of inbound links because there were pages that didn't get redirected, and they lost their overall authority of their domain, which impacted their ranking. It also obviously limits Google discovering new URLs. So what you're going to check is whether or not any of the 404 errors are significant, however, because you definitely do not want to give the developers every single 404 error. In fact, I was brought on board because there was this digital marketer who was doing that with the developers, and the developers were losing their mind. And so they actually got me hired so that way I could prioritize the errors they were seeing inside Google Search Console, in general, prioritizing their technical SEO issues. So there's a way to check whether or not your broken links are meaningful. So inside Google Search Console and Big Webmaster Tools, they both have, hey, we know this URL is broken, and an ability to sort of click on that and say, it matters because people have linked to it from the outside. These places have linked to this one URL, or you've linked to it on all these URLs. So you'd use those reports. You can also prioritize it by looking at the URLs that were originally getting great organic search traffic, but now they don't. So inside Google Analytics, you can pull a report of all your 404 pages and how much traffic those 404 pages have been getting. So that's a good way to kind of get whether or not those links are problematic. And then ultimately, you also want to check to see whether or not the 404 page is useful. Google's got a huge chunk of guidance around how to make sure that your 404 page is useful for a searcher, giving them an ability to search your site, pointing them to other areas of your site that are similar, that kind of thing. It helps Google also crawl. So you want to make sure it's not just a, oops, sorry, it's broken, and search. But ideally, you're going to want to have a, oops, sorry that we've lost you, search. Maybe you were looking for something like this, and give them links, particularly a search engine giving them links. So here's what the report looks like inside of Google Search Console. So you'd flip over to the not found. And this is what it looks like when you pop one of those open. So yeah, you can kind of see that it was linked from all these other places, kind of helps you prioritize. You also want to check in your audit to make sure your 404 pages are showing up as 404 pages, and that they're not showing up as a OK 200 status code instead of 400. Because sometimes you could even like 302 or 301 redirect to a 404 page. It'll show up as an incorrect status code. So if it shows up as incorrect, basically Google will not index or crawl those pages. So you just want to make sure that everything is being labeled correctly. And most of the time when I've seen 403 errors, that has been internal search results. So it's kind of driven me to helping a client troubleshoot blocking their internal search results. So here's where you'd find the soft 404s. So inside Google Search Console, there's a report for them. It gives you the URLs below too, so you can troubleshoot. Your crawl data will also give you the status of every URL that it's crawled, so you can find it there. And if you want to see if a redirect is part of the issue, I love the redirect path plugin because it'll show you hop to hop to hop how the crawler has moved from one URL to the other. And you want to provide recommendations for fixing 404s. So if the content has actually moved and they just didn't redirect, you're going to want to set up a 301 redirect from old content to new. Say it was a redesign and the content still lives on the new site, it's just the URL changed a little. So 301 redirect. It's also really useful, especially in a site redesign kind of scenario, that you go out to the people who actually linked to that page before and let them know the page has moved. I've done this with full-on website redesigns where we knew we were going to change all the URLs because we were changing the site structure completely. And it seems like a lot of effort to go out to the people who liked your website before and link to it and tell them to update their links. And actually, we gave them the new place that their content lives, so that it makes it easy for the webmaster. But what ended up happening is not only did the people we outreach to who liked the site, not only did they update their links to the new link we gave them, but then they also checked out the site and created a whole bunch more new links. So it was super useful, yes, time intensive, but a very easy way to start regaining that link equity. And then you want to make sure you have a good 404 page. So here's the screenshot from the old Google Webmaster Guide. There's still information online from Google about 404 pages. I'll provide a link to it in the lesson plan, but this was the formatted version. And redirects. Let's talk about kind of redirects, because there's SEO friendly ones and then there's non-SEO friendly ones. So a 300 redirect tells the search engine that it has moved permanently. And that's why I use map pins on the previous image. So when I explain redirects people, it's like the URL Google really feels as a pin. Like it knows exactly how to get there. And if you change that URL in any sort of way, so you add punctuation, you add capitalization, you add a dash, it becomes a different URL, another pin, over here. Google doesn't know to find it over here. Google knew it was over here. But when you string a string from the first pin to the second, a 301 redirect, Google goes to that first pin it knew where to find, follows the string to your second one and goes, this is the new one. We'll drop this one, keep this one. Does that make sense? 301 redirect, really important. So it'll transfer all the equity, all the links, or most of the links that come into that first one get transferred to the second one. And if you want to check to see what kind of redirect you're using, or if you're using more than one redirect, because sometimes people, because of redesigns, they put a lot of strings to different pins because they keep changing the URL. You could use the redirect path plugin. It's the one that I like, and that's the screenshot you're seeing. You're going to get this question from developers. How long should I keep these redirects? Well, honestly, it might take months for Google to, depending how popular your site is, that particular URL, it might take Google months to find that first pin or recrawl the first pin and find the string to the second. So John Mueller from Google has recommended that you keep those redirects in place for at least a year. But personally, if it's really important pages, pages that have got good ranking, good links, good authority, you should just keep them live permanently, which always gives developers heartburn for some reason, but you want to keep them permanently. There are other type of redirects that are not friendly. So JavaScript redirects are one of those that are not friendly. Let me make sure I haven't missed 302. No, okay. So the JavaScript redirects are ultimately, they could be used for cloaking. They used to be used for porn sites. So the idea is a user comes in on one, and then you can flip it and show them a different page. So Google can now read JavaScript. It's very irregular in picking up these redirects. So if you were using it strategically, Google might have trouble. Ultimately, 301 redirects are the ones that are recommended. But if for some reason you don't have access to your own server, or you need to redirect people to an internal page once they're logged in, that's when you'd want to be using JavaScript redirects. 302, that's found. But they mean temporary. So, and there's a lot of flurry about this online from Google, because with the transition to HTTPS, a lot of people had to put in place redirects. Google said, 302 is fine. It'll transfer all the equity. Honestly, SEOs aren't seeing that. So real life testing of it really shows that 302s don't transfer all the equity. Still makes sense to do 301. Because generally 302 has always been this, we are temporarily redirecting, like come on back when we clean up the mess, but right now this is temporary. There are plenty of ways for redirects to go wrong. This could cause a huge amount of drama and could be part of the reason why a site lost traffic. So there are a couple things you need to keep an eye out for. One is a 301 redirect and a canonical that conflict with each other. That actually can cause the page to not be indexed at all. So you've got a graphic over there. So if you have said page A has a canonical link, dear Google, on this page, I say the canonical, the page I want you to index, that's what canonical means, is B. Okay, so Google hits A, index B. But what if B redirects to A? You're sending the bot over here to B, the one they're supposed to index. But then you're telling them, redirect back to the one I don't want you to index. Do you see why that might cause a problem? I see this kind of frequently. The other one is a redirect loop, where you'll hop. You're like, old page, new page, back to this old page. Literally get stuck in a circle. So you don't want that. I've seen that too. Or you can have multiple redirects. They've redesigned the site a ton of times, and they've hop. What happens is you start losing these links that came in completely because Google says they don't follow more than 5 hops. I've actually sort of seen potentially maybe even a little bit less. But ultimately, you don't want to keep redirect from old to old to old. At some point, you might just do so page A to page B to page C. You'd actually want to do page A to page C, page B to page C. See what I mean? So it's one hop, not multiple hops. So to check to see if something redirects, the easiest way to figure it out is put the URL in the browser and watch it as it loads. If it changes, you're redirecting. Know exactly how it's redirecting, then you're going to want to use the redirect path plugin. I've given you resources in Moz about redirection in general, so you can learn a little bit more. You'd want to use the crawl data. That will show you all sorts of reports. And you might want to think about actually fixing some of your historical redirects in order to reclaim links. I'll give you a link to that article too in the video lesson plan. So I've talked about this a little bit, but be careful about these chained or too many redirects, because every additional redirect, you lose a little bit of page rank from your links. So Google says, keep it to 3, 5 max. I've seen with 3, you start losing the equity. And, even Bing, I've got a quote about Bing saying, please don't stack them either. So here's what it would look like inside of Deep Crawl. So you can see below that they've actually hopped quite a few times. They've redirected 1 to 1 to 1. So they have redirected 3 times. And ultimately, it's not indexable. Deep Crawl will even tell you that. Makes me super helpful. So here's the instructions for Screaming Frog. So you'd have to export the redirect chains and save as a CSV. Pretty straightforward. And then, just be careful about this looping. It's just like the movie where it's like, hey kids, look, Big Ben Parliament, because you're stuck in the traffic circle. That's exactly what spiders are doing.